Good morning and welcome to Jew in the City Speaks with your host, Allison Josephs, also known as Jew in the City. We have different stories that come our way and different topics that we talk about on the show. It happens to be that today's topic is a less typical one, and yet I think it fits into our mission of Kiddush Hashem and sharing the positive side of the Orthodox community. If you're going to change negative perceptions of Orthodox Jews, as is the founding mission of Jew in the City, then you need to not only push back at the inaccurate representation and ideas and teachings that maybe came to some people's schools, and also look for examples of Orthodox Jews doing things correctly. And we came across a very interesting young man named Zach Levy, who decided that he wanted to shed a light on homelessness. And so he went out to meet with homeless people to share their stories. And he wrote a book about this while still in high school. It's called Project Unhoused, A Teenager's Journey to Share the Stories of America's Homeless. It came out on October 5th this year. Zach, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
So tell us first, before we get into the book, where do you live? Whenever I'm speaking to someone who, is still a minor, I don't say, how did you grow up? But I say, how are you growing up? Yeah, where do you live? Kind of what type of Jewish community are you part of? What kind of school?
Yeah, so I live in Deal, New Jersey, in the Syrian community here. I went to Hillel Yeshiva through elementary school all the way to middle school until I graduated in eighth grade, and I got into High Technology High School, which is a pre-engineering school. And it was a hard decision between me and my family about whether or not I was going to go to this school. I would have access to more difficult classes, but I would be giving up to some degree being in my Jewish community. So thankfully, we've made this decision and it's worked out very well. And I've been able to continue my learning on the side. I learn for almost 2 hours a day with my rabbis in the morning at night. So I've really found a great balance between the two as I've been growing up.
Beautiful. Um, what made you get interested in the topic of homelessness?
Yeah, so about 2 years ago during the summer, my father and I were at a 7-Eleven. It was really hot out, so we stopped in to get a drink. And all of a sudden, somebody cut in front of us in line. She was a woman, maybe 18, 19 at the time. I was 16, 17. And she clearly couldn't afford the drink she was trying to buy. She put an Arizona on the table. And I nudged my father. He stepped in front and paid for her. And almost immediately, she bolted out of the store without a thank you, without really even acknowledging that we had paid for it. Almost seemed like she had stolen it just by the way that she ran out. It was just very sudden. And when we left the store, we realized that she was experiencing homelessness. She was sitting on the side of the street with some meager belongings. And I didn't understand how, at that point in someone's life, they could end up in a position like that. So when I got home, I did what my father taught me. He says, if you have something you want to learn more about, start doing research. I read all these different articles, Wikipedia pages, more scholarly sources, and everything I found pointed to very large scale bird's eye view problems, whether it be losing housing or losing a job, losing a loved one. But I didn't understand how it could get that intense in just a single cause like that. There had to be something before that that I wasn't seeing really reported in these articles. So I started Project Unhoused in order to try to figure out through interviews with homeless individuals the exact chronology, the whole domino chain from start to finish.
Wow. And how old were you when you started meeting with homeless people and interviewing them?
Yeah, so I had my first interview the day before my first day of junior year, high school.
Did you have any fear of speaking to people that are known for being mentally ill or, uh, maybe addicts? I'll tell you, when I started college, my freshman year, we were in San Francisco on a family vacation the week before. I was newly kosher and I was being very careful about what I was eating. My family was not. And we were seeing homeless people everywhere in San Francisco. And I wanted to give money to one of them. And my mother said, can't give money. They're just going to go and get a quick fix. And I thought to myself, I'm going to be in school in Manhattan in a few weeks. I need to do something about this. And so I asked her if she would buy me a big tub of peanut butter and jelly. And every week I bought bread and would make peanut butter and jelly sandwiches and carry them around and pass them out to people that, came to ask for money. It's actually, my husband said, what made him fall in love with me. But generally, we're told to not, you didn't know I was going to have a homeless story there myself, did
No,
you?
that's really an amazing story, and it says a lot
Also,
about you as a person that you're willing to put yourself out there in that way. That's really incredible.
you know what? I was newly religious at the time. I was becoming observant. I mentioned that I was starting to keep kosher. And I also thought to myself, if I am becoming this Orthodox Jew, then shouldn't my acts be, not only acts towards God, but acts towards my fellow man? Look, I've got kind of busy with life since then, and I don't do that anymore. But what I will tell you is that, like, in the time since then, I remember after a board meeting, we had extra sandwiches, and I went to wraps. I went to hand one to a man in the shadows, and he came out and his face was covered in tattoos. And I have to tell you, I felt a little bit terrified. Certainly in New York City, there's been an increased issue with homelessness, and some of the homeless people seem really scary. So I guess the first question as a child, did that seem scary? Were your parents concerned? Like, how did you manage the risk versus trying to get this information?
That was one of the biggest drawbacks that we were thinking about originally when I was starting the project, and that my parents and my cousins, whatever, anyone I spoke to, pointed out to me. So I did all of my interviews through shelters. My first few interviews I did with the Winifred Canright House, which is a HIV positive men's homelessness shelter in Asbury Park, New Jersey, which is right near where I live. So everyone was already devoting themselves to recovery, and it was a very controlled environment. Later, I did interviews with people who were actively homeless, but even then, it was in a controlled environment with people around me. So I never had any fear in that aspect. But later on in my journey, I did have something of a scary story that was related to antisemitism. Um, as part of the project, I founded a winter clothing drive. So I was collecting hundreds of bags of winter clothing. I put signs up in all community stores, etc. Drove to people's houses, whatever I could do to collect as much as possible. And I believe our fourth distribution, we've had 8 so far. So at the fourth one we had last winter, somebody came up to us. It was me and my father and another woman who was helping us do all the distribution. She was a Muslim African American woman. Her name is Cherry Elliott. She has been extremely helpful with everything we've been doing with this project. She brought us to our project to give out clothes, and this time we were just set up on a main street in Asbury Park. And somebody came up to her and said, "You're Muslim. Why are you associating with these Jews? Why are you doing this with them? You shouldn't be associating with Jews." And she said, "We're in the same fight together. We're trying to help the community. If you put in any effort to realizing who these people are and what they're doing, you would understand." And he continued to be aggressive, and it was sort of getting to a scary point. Eventually, he realized of the 5 other people, or sorry, 5 people total, I think there were 2 or 3 other people getting clothing with us at the same time. He realized all of them were against him, and he sort of backed off at one point. But it was somewhat of a scary situation.
And that guy wasn't even homeless. This is just a regular anti-Semite.
It's unclear.
Okay.
I don't think he was homeless, but we were in a not so great neighborhood. So
Mhm.
most of the people in that area have need for clothing and bed sheets and everything else we were giving out, whether or not they're actually experiencing homelessness.
How does your Jewish values and your Jewish education, how did that impact your desire to kind of look at the other person, to, do acts of kindness, to kind of lift them up in a time when they're so down and vulnerable?
Yeah, that was one of the biggest motivators for me. That from a very young age, my father always taught us that chesed and volunteering is the most important thing. We always worked with different community organizations. I don't know if you know, but SBH is a big organization in Deal and Brooklyn, Sephardic Bechor Cholim. So my father and I do a lot of work with them. Also, Miss Eskim, it's we deliver sorry, I'm used to saying it to non-Jews. So I would say prayer books, but sidors and chairs for Shiva for those families who have lost a loved one. And we do a lot of volunteering, and this was always some sort of lesson that was very important to me and my family. And this is just another example of a way that I was able to bring it into something I saw. And
What about the aspect of Kiddush Hashem? Because I think that there's kind of a bunch of different ways that sort of the insularity or judgment that people have on Orthodox Jews, and I think also the Syrian community of you're insular, you only think about yourself, you're only involved with yourself. Um, Kind of what's the motivation or kind of what teachings did you grow up with of we have to spread the light beyond our, you know, Dalit sort of are the corners of our community and be a light unto the nations.
I will admit that wasn't a major thing that I was thinking about when I started the project. It sort of came up later that I realized that in the wake of October 7th, I published my book only 2 days before. I realized that it was more important than ever to sort of spread this project as an example of Jews doing good in the world and Kiddush Hashem, light into nations. But in the beginning, it was really about I saw this area of need that I thought I could help with. And my parents really never taught me to distinguish between our community and outside of our community in that way. We would volunteer with all these community organizations, but also every week we would work with hospice, and we would go out. My sister and my brother play different instruments, and they would play, and we would host all these events in the memory care unit there. And it was always just so incredible to be able to meet these older people, hear about their stories. So within my family, there wasn't much of a distinction there with where we are volunteering. And yeah, that
Anyone
doesn't really play
listening,
into it
for
significantly.
anyone listening and wondering how do you raise a kid that turns out like this, you do it by setting the example like this in the home. That's very clear. So let's talk about some of your findings now that we know what such a fine young man that you were raised to be. How many people did you speak to, and kind of what were the overarching themes that you saw?
Yeah, so I interviewed 8 people, and in my winter clothing distribution, spoke to many more and got to ask them some questions. And the overarching discovery was that there's so many misconceptions about homelessness that are very frequently not true. So one of the things that you mentioned earlier is that drugs and alcohol is what causes homelessness most of the time. And yes, that is the case pretty often that people who are on the streets are using drugs, but in what I've seen, it's very infrequently the primary cause. So my goal going into this was to find the root cause, what happens before everything else that leads to homelessness. In almost every case that I've seen, sorry, in every case that I've seen, drugs and alcohol came after something beforehand, which set them up on a road that led them into homelessness. So there's a psychological term called self-regulation, which is the idea that when somebody has any sort of intense emotions, whether it be anger, joy, sadness, frustration, that they're able to overcome these emotions. And this is almost uniquely taught in the household and by the people surrounding the adults around them, so in their community. In our community, we have very strong familial ties. We have large extended families that are always there for us if anything ever goes wrong. We have great parents who teach us what we need to know about the world before we enter the workforce and beyond. We stay very insular and we don't really go out far most of the time. So we don't have this problem as much. And if this problem ever arises, we have a huge safety net within the community that's always willing to pick us up and put us back on our feet. Some communities, or even most communities in America, do not have this. um, Almost all of the people who I interviewed grew up in some sort of family where either one parent or both parents did not did not have the opportunity to teach them this skill of self-regulation.
Hmm.
So an example is a man I interviewed. His name is James Allay. He's 45 years old now. Grew up in a very nice area. Went to a private Catholic school. Um, Middle class, upper middle class, and he wanted to become a filmmaker. His father was sort of not always around, negligent, worked late, drank, wasn't really a part of the family in that way because he never really put in too much effort to raising his children. He left most of the work to James's mother, who suffered from agoraphobia, which meant that she had this mental health condition that was always dragging her back. She suffered from periods of depression. But what agoraphobia is mainly is that they wouldn't stray too far from home. So there weren't really any other major adults in his life that he could learn from. They didn't go too far. I think the supermarket was like the boundary. Their
Mm.
local supermarket, they would never drive past that area with his mother. When his parents got divorced, when he was my age, a senior in high school, he wasn't able to go to college because his father took all the money and left. So he entered the workforce. He started working at a fast food chain, found a stable income, got had a girlfriend, had a nice friend group, and his life would have went on normally, if not for three sudden experiences that took him by storm. He was out at the bar just drinking socially. Drinking was never a problem for him, and he got mugged. Somebody punched him in the jaw, uppercut, completely destroyed his jaw. He was brought into the emergency room, put on morphine for the pain, and it was a very long recovery process. During this time, he obviously couldn't work, so his job was postponed, or I don't know the exact term. Sorry, he couldn't work for a little while, and I don't know the exact timeline. He wasn't very specific, but I believe it was a few months later that his younger brother, who was, I believe, 4 years younger than him at the time, so I think around my age, 18, died in a tragic car accident on a drive doing an errand that he was supposed to be doing. So he always felt like he was responsible. He lost his faith. And it was the combination of these two issues. And then a few weeks later was Hurricane Sandy. Him and his family lost their apartment. So it
Hmm.
was that he had never been given the emotional skills to deal with this issue. And what happened later is that he started using morphine, not for the pain, but for the emotional pain because he couldn't self-regulate himself. So he used these substances to do it for him.
Hmm. I'll tell you, we work at Jew in the City. One of our branches is called Makom. We work with a lot of former Haredi and Hasidic Jews, and the vast majority of them are descendants of Holocaust survivors. And there are mental health issues that grew out of a trauma so big. And there definitely are people that, their Jewishness came through in such a negative way because they were lacking the ability to self-regulate. But I think the thing that you touched on that reminded me of a conversation I had a couple of years ago is that we almost never see homelessness in the Jewish community. We were having a roundtable discussion with Black faith leaders. It was a really meaningful conversation. And one comment that they made is that they really both look up to and have some jealousy towards the Jewish community that we will not let our own, live on the street. There is that safety net to make sure that that never happens. That's not to say that we don't have poverty. It's not to say we don't have mental health. That's not to say that there isn't abuse. Obviously, there are all those issues, but that sort of like final straw of, lacking a home. It's basically unheard of when it's this thing that exists in the rest of society. I think that
100%.
makes your interest in this topic all the more interesting because it's really something that's outside of our community, and yet it grabbed you. Um, what is your hope that will come about your nonprofit, this book? Like, what change do you hope to affect by getting more information about the root causes of how people, get to these tragic places?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really ties into the story that you shared earlier, which is that you found your own unique way, in a small way, to make a difference in the lives of the people that you are passing on the streets. What I found is that there's a restaurant in my area called the John Bon Jovi Soul Kitchen. I'm sure you know John Bon Jovi. He's a very large rock singer in New Jersey, and he founded this organization called the John Bon Jovi Soul Foundation, which has this kitchen. It's a very unique idea that I haven't seen done anywhere else, and it is extremely effective in what I've seen in Red Bank, which is where it's located. And the whole idea is it's a community restaurant where anybody can go and eat, and if you can't afford a meal, you don't have to pay.
I'm going
And
to tell, there's actually a Jewish version of this called
oh,
Masbia. It's
I didn't
made
know about
by,
that.
yes, so there's a Masbia is a restaurant without registers. It was founded by a Hasidic man named Alexander Rappaport, and it serves mostly non-Jewish clientele all over the five boroughs. And his grandmother was a Holocaust survivor. She helped people find food in the Holocaust. And he said growing up, she always had people at her table that nobody wanted. And that was the legacy of his family. And he was looking for a way to continue that. And
Wait,
so
what's
he
that called? I want to
yeah, you
write this
should
down
connect
for
with
later.
him. Masbia, Masbia. I mean, John Bon Jovi is great, and there's certainly, a need for this everywhere. But Alexander Rappaport, as a Hasidic man, I think has five different branches
Wow.
of this restaurant without registers. Talk about a Kiddush Hashem. So
That's
that's sort
amazing.
of
I didn't know about that. So it's a very similar idea. Exactly what you're saying. Their motto is dining with dignity, where
mhm.
they make everyone, it's completely anonymous as to who's paying and who's not. I had the opportunity to see one of the people who I interviewed, a 70-year-old woman who was living with her daughter, who had developmental issues. Again, their family never had any drug problems. It was purely financial. Their fall into homelessness, no alcohol, no nothing. During COVID, they just couldn't afford housing anymore due to a variety of causes, which I don't think we have time to explain. But I saw her at a shelter and she had just undergone a very traumatic experience. She was at a quick check with her daughter, just trying to use the bathroom, and she was almost chased out uh,
Mm,
by screams. And it was just horrifying to hear this from her. But you could tell she was nervous and there was like tears in her eyes and she was like hunched over. And when I saw her at the John Bon Jovi Soul Kitchen, she was a completely different person. She was dressed nice. She was smiling. She stood up, gave me a big hug. When I walked by, I saw her like sitting straight. It was just amazing the difference that um, somebody not knowing that she was homeless did to her. It made a huge difference to her just being treated with respect by those around her. So, what you did in New York City, giving out sandwiches, is great because you're feeding them, but also, even better, is that you're treating them like another person and they recognize that. And it makes a huge difference to them. And that's really my goal in this project. That when I started, I heard so many people saying, ignore them. If you help them, they're just going to use it for drugs. But that's not what we should be thinking. We should look for opportunities to treat them with respect and to treat them like humans who have fallen apart hard times, most of the time through no fault of their own, is what I found. And they should not be treated like animals.
mm. And I think also we didn't touch upon this. I kind of referenced it. To be a Jew, we're an other people. We were strangers in a strange land, and I think to recognize people that don't fit into society is always, such a Jewish value. And it's really commendable what you've done and the awareness that you've raised. And say the book one more time so our
Yeah.
listeners can know how to get it.
Yeah, Project Unhoused. It is available on Amazon, and yeah,
All right. Well, Zach Levy, thank you for your curiosity and then the work that you did after that and for making an incredible Kiddush Hashem. If you're up to this at only a senior in high school, God willing, you have a really bright future ahead. And I'll invite you back on our show the next time you have your next update because I'm sure there's more to come.
thank you. It's
And
been
you are,
amazing
yeah,
being here.
heading to Princeton next year, and we wish you a lot of Hatzlacha and keep spreading the Jewish pride.
Thank you.
And thanks for listening. You can catch us same time, same place next week. Bye bye.